what is anxiety? Is it overactive mind, like you're overthinking and then you just start getting scared?
So stress is going to show up in the body, physiological responses, accelerated heart rate, shaky palms, sweaty palms, nausea, headache, backache.
So like approximately after how many days, if a person is still feeling sad, they should start thinking maybe I need to go and talk to somebody.
It's 2 weeks. It says 2 weeks of pervasive sadness almost all day, every day. So the idea is that a lot of young girls they wake up in the morning and they're kind of paralyzed. They're unable to get out of bed. Dopamine is fantastic if you've earned it. If you have done something hard and you get a rush of dopamine, it's amazing, right? But now what's happening is without earning dopamine, we are getting so many hits of dopamine really, really quickly to the point where our system is going to kind of crash and burn. Like if you want to have more dopamine, which is motivation and focus, watch a podcast. If I'm not treated well, I don't stick around too long. I talk about it, I confront it. I don't play games, I don't manipulate, I don't hide, I don't blame, I have open conversations. But if somebody isn't giving me really what I need, I, in a loving, respectful way, say, this isn't actually working for me. That's a secure partner.
Welcome to the show, Dr. Ayehsa. Finally, we made it happen.
Yes, thank you so much, Namrata. So excited to be here.
Yeah, you have so much to share that I feel honored. Thank you so much for coming.
Wow.
And psychology has always intrigued me, fascinated me. The profound impact of psychology on human behavior is truly captivating. I really feel. Anytime I hear any, about any unpleasant situations, experiences, it's funny because I end up Googling the psychology behind such and such behavior, psychology behind such and such behavior, because no, I mean, it's true, right?
Wow. Me too. I do the same. Yeah.
Ayehsa, what inspired you to become a psychologist?
Honestly, pain. That is what inspired me. I struggled a lot and I didn't know growing up, I didn't know that I was struggling with anxiety. I was considered a shy child. So I just thought it was shyness and I had a very active mind. So internally, there was all of this self-doubt and self-criticism and not knowing and not being sure. And I just thought, something's wrong with me. Tell no one, hide it, push it down, and everybody's okay except for you, which I thought about myself. So I just thought, just don't tell anybody and act okay. But I was literally in so much stress all the time. And I honestly didn't know it was anxiety. I just thought it was, I'm broken, something's wrong with me. Anyways, long story short, I ended up experiencing some traumatic experiences as a teenager and then as a young woman, and ended up divorced with 2 children and with no job and no education and no future. And every Friday night, I would go to like Borders bookstore with a little tub of ice cream and sit in the self-help aisle and read these psychology books on how to fix myself.
Like
And
you would look at your symptoms and then
yeah. Yeah. And I just kept thinking everything was wrong with me. I identified with so many things, personality disorders and depression and eating disorders and anxiety. And it was overwhelming. I was depressed. I was a mess. And then I kept thinking, I'm reading all these books. Why don't I go to school and maybe learn about some of this?
Yeah.
And that's what started the quest, to be honest.
So what is anxiety? I know is it overactive mind, like you're overthinking and then you just start getting scared, I guess?
Yeah. Yeah, actually, you're
That's
absolutely
like
right.
very, very like a layman definition of anxiety.
Yeah. So let's break it down to 2 things. There is stress and there's worry. So
Okay.
stress is going to show up in the body, physiological responses, accelerated heart rate, shaky palms, sweaty palms, nausea, headache, backache, any kind of like nervousness, jitteriness, shallow breathing, all physiological responses. We call that stress, right?
Mhm.
Worry is going to be the thoughts that accompany it. So, distorted thoughts, cognitive distortions, unhealthy thoughts, unhelpful thoughts. And the combination, the intersection of stress in the body and worry in the mind is what we call anxiety. So when you said, is it just like all of these thoughts that show up as fear? I always think of it as like, let's look at the brain in two ways, right? There's the lower brain, the limbic system, the fight or flight response, and the higher brain, the prefrontal cortex, which is rational, logical thinking. Anxiety is a very overstimulated lower brain. So the limbic system is on high alert. It is just going, 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 and a very understimulated prefrontal cortex. So the lower brain is overactivated, the higher brain is underactivated, and we're caught. And I call it hijacked by anxiety.
So, does any like traumatic events, would that trigger anxiety, or is this something that the person always has? Does it become worse after certain events?
Yeah. So, anxiety has both predisposition as far as genes go. So you can be genetically
It is
predispositioned for
genetic. Okay, that's
anxiety.
what yeah.
Yeah, so there is a part of it that is genetic, but we know that the brain is malleable. So let's say you don't have any anxiety in your family, but so you're not genetically predispositioned, but you are in a really chaotic environment or an abusive environment or at home or at school or at work or something. That can trigger anxiety because again, it's going to be the physiological response in the body, the fear, then the avoidance of facing that anxiety. Or it could be that you have a great family, you have good conditioning, you have good family role models, but maybe the genetic piece came in and something happened. So I guess to answer your question, it is really both. I would say if I had to choose between genetic predisposition and environment, we're always going to go towards environment because even if you have the blueprint for anxiety, your brain is malleable, you can get better. But if you are in an environment and you're not actually getting help or you're not looking at what's going on, like me, you're pushing it down and just acting like nothing is wrong, which I think so many of us right now are doing because we just feel like I don't want to talk about it. I don't want to tell anybody. I don't want to be different. I don't want to be looked at as incompetent. So we have a lot of high functioning anxiety going on right now.
Yeah. Can it get triggered at any point in life, or do you
Yeah.
see more in childhood and then it just persists as we become adults?
Well, again, I think going back to that blueprint, if there's a childhood, because the brain adapts to things, but it's that blueprint in childhood, I think, is so important. Meaning that if you have resilience as a child, which a lot of times it is family upbringing, it is the environment you're in, if you have compassionate, kind people around you that don't invalidate your feelings, don't tell you to get over it or there's nothing wrong with you. It doesn't have to be a huge trauma. It can just be kind of like that pervasive, something's wrong with me and I'm hiding it type of thing. But I haven't really met anyone specifically that says, I had no anxiety at all, and all of a sudden now I have anxiety. I would see that if that happened, it would be more like a PTSD event where something really traumatic happened and then PTSD developed, and anxiety is part of PTSD. But just anxiety on its own, it honestly, it could happen because of something traumatic happened or something painful happened. And then now, I think the key of it is that let's say I have anxiety, something happened. I was driving to work and I got into an accident, God forbid. And now I have anxiety about driving.
Got it.
So if I avoid driving, my anxiety will keep going up. If I face the accident and I face what happened and I process it and I get back in the car and I start driving in that route again and again and again, my anxiety will go down. So it's avoidance plays a huge role in anxiety. Most of us, when we're anxious about something, we avoid the thing that gives us anxiety, which makes our anxiety go up.
Oh, okay. So the key is to keep doing it.
Is to keep doing it.
So,
Yeah.
which people I mean, we may not think. You're right. If something makes us more anxious, we tend to move away from it.
We do. It's a natural tendency and it's intuitive. It feels like, well, if this is giving me anxiety, why would I do it? So we stop doing it. And so what the brain thinks is the brain is not interested in how happy you are. The brain, at least the lower brain, that limbic system, is very interested in keeping you safe. So the more you show the brain that this is dangerous, the more the brain reinforces danger, which basically means the brain is going to then give you a lot of cortisol, a lot of these stress hormones, and it's going to give you a lot of adrenaline. It's going to pump it out. When you feel that physiological response in your body, you're nervous, you're sweaty, your hands are shaking, you're feeling nervous because of adrenaline over, like stimulated with adrenaline and cortisol, you're going to say, are going to have these thoughts that are going to be like, this is dangerous. This is dangerous. I can't do this. I'm feeling anxious, which is going to pump more cortisol, more adrenaline, and you're caught in that loop. So what are you going to do? You're going to avoid it. The next time you go to do it, the brain says, oh, this was dangerous. And it's going to pump more of these stress hormones, thinking it's keeping you safe. But if you actually do the thing that the brain thinks is dangerous, then the brain says, oh, you survived that. You didn't die. And it stops giving so many of these stress hormones. So it's literally doing the opposite of what you think is the intuitive thing to do.
What is the difference between panic attacks and anxiety? Is it the same thing or are they related?
They are related. So I would say that anxiety that is not treated and
Mhm.
it continues and continues and we continue to avoid, a lot of people then start feeling panic. And then the anxiety actually goes up to, it increases, and then panic attacks sometimes are a result of the unresolved anxiety. And a lot of times we see it like with agoraphobia, where now people are afraid to be leaving the house, they're afraid to get in a car, they're afraid to be in a shopping mall or in around crowds or people. So the panic attack, again, it feels to a lot of people like a heart attack, but the panic attack is just saying there's nowhere for all of this stress to go,
So
right? So,
anxiety left untreated can
yes,
manifest.
into panic, exactly, into panic attacks. Yeah, that's what I've seen and experienced. That a lot of clients that have not managed their anxiety well, either they're numbing it, either they're avoiding it, either they're just actually not processing it, not using any exposure. Then I've seen that the next step it kind of sometimes goes to is panic.
So for anxiety, we were talking about it like when we first started that people don't want to seek help. People don't want to talk about it. The ideal thing is to go for therapy and go from there. But for the population of people who don't want to seek any help, how can they help themselves?
So there's so many coping skills we can learn, and we can read books, we can Google it, we can watch videos. I think right now we have so much information at our fingertips.
So what are some of the top coping skills that person can do? And of course, I mean, the ideal thing is to seek help, but yeah.
Right, right. So again, we're going to look at it from that twofold. For the physiological responses in the body, we're
Uh,
going to be looking at grounding techniques. So there's two really ways we can look at it. One is actually shaking the body, right? So voluntarily shaking your body, because again, this limbic system, this brain of ours that's developed, the reason that it has all this fight or flight going on is because, okay, I'll give you an example and then we'll get to the tools.
yeah,
But
yeah.
imagine that, you're sitting in your house, you're up in your room, and the smoke alarm goes off. You have a smoke alarm in your house, the smoke alarm goes off. Now, my smoke alarm is terrible. It says fire, fire, fire. It's so loud. The dogs get upset. The whole
Yeah,
house goes haywire. I imagine yours is the same.
same thing, yeah.
Same thing, right? Smoke alarm goes off. The smoke alarm is not the problem. Like if I said to you, let's get rid of the smoke alarm, it's just making so much noise. Let's pull it out of the wall and throw it out the window. Nobody has, up till now, has told me that's a good idea. Everyone I tell that, I say, why don't you just take your smoke alarm? They always say no, because how am I going to know if there's a real fire? So smoke alarm is indicating there is a threat, there is a fire. So what do? Immediately, I go from homeostasis, which is me just relaxing upstairs,
Yeah.
to fight or flight. Fight or flight is that the whole, just my nervous system has said, let's take all the blood flow, let's leave the digestion, let's leave everything that's relaxing, and let's go to fight or flight so that all the blood flow will now go to my hands, my feet, so I can run, I can fight, I can escape, whatever I need to do. So it's your brain's so smart, it sends you all those signals. Now I run downstairs and I look, oh, I left something on the stove and I need to turn the stove off, or I went downstairs, my husband's making an egg. That's it. No threat. And as soon as I discover that, my brain pretty quickly goes back to homeostasis. It's always wanting to go back to homeostasis. And it says, no threat, you're fine. Now, if I stayed up in my room and the smoke alarm is going off, going off, going off, and I never leave my room, I'm going to feel terrible because I went from homeostasis to fight or flight, but I'm still stuck in fight or flight. I have not gone out, investigated, and I have not figured out what's wrong, and then it won't go back to homeostasis. Anxiety is in fight or flight, and you're never investigating if there's a threat or not. So when I say that to people, right, it's like, hey, your smoke alarm is telling you go outside and check. Your anxiety is your internal smoke alarm. You can't get rid of it. You don't want to get rid of it. You want it because if you are about to get attacked by an animal, or you're about to fall off a cliff, or you're driving and all of a sudden someone's coming at you, you need that fight or flight to survive.
Fear, fight, and flight.
Right? You need it. But the problem has become is people are now in this fight or flight, but they're not investigating, is there a real threat? So they're staying there. So if I said to someone, okay, so the threat now is someone's not going to like me. My boss is going to fire me. That's the anxiety people are experiencing. I'm anything. There's traffic. I'm stuck in traffic. That's the anxiety. Or I hear a lot of this. I don't want to go to school. If, kids will judge me. These are the threats. And if we don't question the threats, we're going to stay in fight or flight. So the first thing I would say to people is, are you investigating if this threat is real or imagined? Because if I come downstairs at 3 a.m. and there's somebody at my window with a gun, that's fear. That's absolutely okay. My body will either run or it'll fight, or it'll do something. But if I come down at 3 a.m. a week later and I feel the same symptoms, my heart is racing, my hands are shaking, but there's nobody in my window, that's anxiety. It is a non-existent threat. It is just in my head that, oh my God, this is a threat, this is a threat. And if I don't question that, and if I don't notice it, that the threat is actually in my mind, it may have happened last week, that was real, this time it's not real. So the first thing is going to be start questioning your threats. Start looking, are these threats real or imagined? Then the physiological responses, I was thinking in the body, we can shake because imagine, right? You come down, you look out the window, you're scared, you're shaking, your hands are shaking. Exaggerate that. Get that stress out of you. Exercise, kickbox, run, jump, jumping jacks, whatever you can do to remove the stress. The other option is going to be grounding techniques. Why? Because when we're in anxiety, we're almost always in the future. What if, what if, what if? And when we do grounding, whether that be looking around the room and noticing colors of things, brings us to the present moment. If it's deep breathing, the breath is the quickest way to get out of fight or flight. Why? Because when you're really in danger and there's a real threat, you won't breathe calmly. You can't. You're going to have that accelerated heart rate, accelerated breath, because that's your body's way of running and escaping. So when you breathe, take 3 or 4 deep breaths, your brain says, oh, I cannot be in danger. False alarm, turn the alarm off, get the cortisol down, let's get the adrenaline going down. So that's one part of it. Is going to be breath work, grounding exercises. The other part of it is going to be the worry thoughts. It's going to be CBT, some sort of challenge your thoughts, cognitive distortions. Look at all these maladaptive, unhelpful, unhealthy, inaccurate thoughts and think, challenge them. Is this accurate? Am I going to die or am I going to faint? These are the 3 things I hear with people with anxiety. I'm going to die, I'm going to faint, and I'm going to throw up if I do X. So we say, okay, let's do it. And let's see if you die, if you throw up, or if you faint. And 99% of the time they don't. They go to work or they go to class or they ask the person or they have the conversation or they do the confrontation. They do whatever is giving them anxiety and they're okay. And then finally, instead of CBT or maybe with CBT, mindfulness as far as noticing your thoughts. So it's not going to be so much challenging the thoughts, but just realizing, oh, I am not my thoughts. These thoughts are just coming and going and they're temporary. And then doing some sort of like acceptance commitment therapy work, which is going to be lots of mindfulness and more of that witness consciousness and observing thoughts. So many different tools we can use for anxiety.
Goals, yeah. At what point should somebody seek therapy and help, like professional help for anxiety?
So, if anxiety is coming in the way of functioning, so anytime it's interfering with functioning, yeah, and functioning is always, we break it down to school, work, relationships, and social situations. If you are struggling in school, your grades are affected. If at work you're unable to stay, doing the best work that you can, you dread going to work, you're having issues with your coworkers or your boss is noticing you're not doing well. If your family members are saying, hey, something's wrong, you're not really here, you're not present, you're not available for me. If social situations, you're not going to get-togethers or parties or meetings, or you're just not socially connecting with others, if those are all being affected, then you probably need some help to manage it.
Sounds painful.
It is. It
To
is
just go
super
through it.
painful.
I can't even imagine what you must have gone through. I mean, you were a kid. I mean, were you a kid? You were a little
Yeah,
old.
it
Started when
started
you were
in
a child.
childhood. It did start when I was a child. And to be honest with you, my mother was very anxious, right? So I don't think I escaped it because I had the genetic predisposition and I had the conditioning. And by
Right.
conditioning, I mean watched this role model show and exhibit signs of anxiety all the time. So, how could I have learned how to cope with emotions, how to regulate myself, how to, if you're raised by an anxious parent, basically all you do is you try to be good as much as possible, because when you're not good, they get very dysregulated and they get very anxious and they get upset and they get angry. So you're just always trying to people please in order to keep that person calm.
I want to talk about that too, people pleasing personality. Yeah.
Yeah, it stems from some of this, right? I mean,
Yeah,
as
yeah. I mean,
children,
genetic role model experiences and then divorce, I'm sure that didn't make it any better. Um,
the divorce brought upon a lot of shame, and shame is all about hiding. And so, if you have anxiety and you're hiding it, then you have shame and you're hiding that.
so first of all, I think we should all be open to talking about this, like mental health issues and conditions. And then secondly, if somebody has it, then they should go and get help if they're not able to manage it on their own.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think it's such a relief to know that there is a name for it. There's such a relief to know that you're not alone in it, right? Because when I started actually working on myself, I realized, the isolation and the loneliness that comes from thinking you're the only one, thinking that everybody else is fine except for me. When you realize this is called anxiety and millions of people suffer from it from
I just
all
don't
age
talk about
groups.
it. Yeah, you may get no friends. Yeah, very true.
Yeah, so that helps too.
So, is anxiety in any way related to depression? Because some of the symptoms we talked about, not being able to socialize and not wanting to meet friends and kind of sounded like depressive symptoms too.
Yeah, they can be interchangeable, but I think depression, when we think about anxiety, I always think about the future. When I think about depression, I always think about the past. So when we have a lot of rumination, right, our thoughts are not about what if, but the thoughts are, why did this happen? Why did I do this? A lot of guilt, a lot of self-judgment, a lot of self-criticism. And then there's a lot of like hopelessness, helplessness. There's a lot of just aches and pains. There's lack of motivation. There's no getting out of bed. There's either a lot of eating or not eating enough. But what's pervasive about depression is it feels to the person who's depressed that, again, I'm alone in it, but it's not so much about the future. They're more hopeless and helpless about the future, where anxiety is, how am I going to cope with this? Depression is, I'm stuck and I just don't have motivation. And oftentimes we'll say, I don't have motivation to live. I don't have motivation to get better. I can't even get out of bed. So they're similar, but they're also different. Where anxiety is a lot of that physiological kind of like jittery. With depression, it feels much more like this blunt uh, affect where it's just kind of like the best way I can describe depression for me when I went through it was like watching paint dry, watching grass grow. It's like so like walking in mud, right? It's very, very, and depressive symptoms usually look like they're always very, very, it feels very personal. Again, it's only me.
So, Ayesha, what is the difference between being sad and being depressed? They say a lot of times that events such as loss of loved ones, like a relationship, be it by death or other means, divorce, job, loss of work, trauma, abuse, can trigger depression.
Yes.
But certain times, some of these events can simply make a person sad.
Yeah.
So, what is the distinction? And at what point you can continue on and say, at what point should somebody seek help? Because even this, I feel like it's not very much talked about.
Yeah. You're right. You're absolutely right. We're left so confused, right?
Yeah.
Thinking, am I not supposed to be sad or am
Sometimes
I
it
in
is okay to be sad. Certain things make
100%?
you.
No, I agree with you. I think you're absolutely right. I think it is essential to be sad because if we are not sad, then how do we really know happiness or joy? And I
Right.
think a lot of, again, you were talking earlier, I so appreciate when you talk about our culture because so much of it is in our culture.
It's a lot, Aisha. I think I can make like an entire podcast on that. And the reason
Right?
I say that is because I did a podcast last year on teen mental health.
Yeah,
And even on teen mental health, its parents have to learn a lot more than kids.
you're right.
Accepting it, making it okay, that it's okay to be not okay. It
Yeah,
has to come from elders. Kids don't know.
right.
So I keep coming back to the culture part where, yeah, we do have to be very open talking about it.
Yeah, so I think it's so important, when you said, and I keep bringing up my mom, and I love my mom. I lost my mom a couple of years ago, but nobody in this world loved me as much as my mom. And yet, that's my example that I go back to because that shaped a lot of my kind of maladaptive behaviors. So I'll give you an example. I am sad, and my mom would say, no, 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 don't be sad. Don't be sad. Don't be sad. And give me, if I cried about something, give me a tissue, give me water, give me a hug, feed me something. So the idea is always for their own inability to regulate their own emotions, their children have to be okay. Their children have to be happy all the time for them to be okay. It's, we have one emotion that's acceptable and it's happiness. But if we're angry, we shouldn't be angry. If we're sad, we shouldn't be sad. If we feel ashamed, if we feel guilty, it's just this idea in our culture, push it down, get rid of it as quickly as possible. But every single emotion serves a purpose. And sadness is such an important emotion. It's
Yeah.
like, if we don't feel sad, how can we have compassion for someone who's going through something?
No.
How
And
can,
you have to sit with your grief. You have to sit with your
yes,
sadness to come out of it. But yeah.
you're so right. So my very first client that I did work with therapy with, he started to cry and I quickly grabbed tissues and gave it to him, thinking that, I'm comforting him. That's what I learned about when someone cries, you give them a tissue. That means you're kind and compassionate. And I remember my supervisor saying to me, she said, that may have been the first time this man felt safe to cry in front of someone. And because you had so much anxiety about sitting with his grief that you couldn't handle it, that you gave him a bunch of tissues, you might as well, and she didn't say it like this, but this is what I understood. You might as well have said to him, stop crying right now. I can't handle it. So that was a huge lesson for me, how it feels to sit with someone's grief, how to sit with my own grief. And sometimes there were clients I would go to and say to them, can I just, and this was like, let's say we're doing a group. And after the group, someone's just sitting there. And I'd go up and say, hey, can I sit with you? And they'd be like, yeah. And I could tell they don't want to talk, they don't want to share, but I can just sit next to them. And they're sad, and I can be sad with them. They don't have to stop. They don't have to explain. They don't have to talk about it if they don't want to. It's like if someone falls into a ditch, instead of just immediately saying, get out, get better, you just kind of go down a couple of steps and sit with them. And then when they're ready, we can come out together. That's the whole thing I think about sadness. We all need to sit with our sadness. The difference between sadness and depression is if you look at children, think of a child who's really sad, right? Their favorite toy broke, or their sister or brother got something they didn't and they're sad. If we allow them to fully feel that emotion of sadness, think about how long it takes physiologically to move through the body. Almost every emotion, it takes about 90 seconds. That's it.
Really?
90, yeah. Like even an emotion as deep as anger. So if we sat with anger and let it move through our body physiologically, within 90 seconds, it could leave our body. What do? We go from the body into the mind, and then we start thinking about the anger and thinking about it and thinking about it. We get angrier and angrier, and he said this and he said that.
Because
But
people are like angry all the time.
all the time. So instead of it being 90 seconds, it becomes an hour or a week or a month or a year of this anger because we went into the mind instead of in the body. So sadness is something you feel in the body, fully feel it, cry, grieve, scream, punch a pillow, sleep, eat, nap, whatever you need to do, fully feel it. Going back to the child, let's say the child came and cried, and I did not stop the child from crying. I even held the child. Hold a child who's crying, let them fully feel their emotion. After a couple of minutes, you know what they do? They get up and they're like, okay, leave me now. And they go back to playing because they felt it. What we do is we push it down, we repress it, suppress it, and then it comes up, we push it down, and then eventually we just add drops and drops of sadness, and they just become heavier and heavier and heavier and heavier.
Our natural response, reflex, whatever you call, is to just comfort. Oh, it's okay. It's okay. You don't have to cry. It's going to be, yeah, yeah, you're right.
We do that a lot.
But
Don't
instead,
cry.
you should just let them just cry. Of course, I mean, within
Yeah.
limits, but yeah,
Within limits, but if we really let them feel it. Now, the younger they are, the
let
less
them
they'll
feel it.
cry.
It's more of the right. Um,
Yeah, the longer we prevent them from crying. The reason people have such extreme explosions of sadness that goes into depression is because they have all of this residue that they haven't felt. And then they just have all of this backed up emotion. So I had this one client, he said, I've lost my dad, I lost my grandmother, I lost, a few family members. And he said, I never cried, I never cried. And he said, and I went to this distant relative's funeral, and he said, I couldn't stop crying. And I said, oh, because you were not protecting yourself, because you didn't even think you were going to cry. But think of the amount of unmourned losses that we have in our life that
yeah,
just were never mourned.
that happens actually. Yeah.
So depression is different, right? Depression is, again, it's pervasive. It affects everything in my life. Everything is hopeless. It is permanent. I will never get better. I will always feel this way. It is personal. It's only happening to me. Where sadness is universal. Everyone's sad. I'm not the only one. Sadness is temporary. Sadness is, I feel this way now. It's like a storm. It'll come, it'll go. I'll feel better.
No, so like approximately after how many days, if a person is still feeling sad, they should start thinking maybe I need to go and talk to somebody. Maybe not
So,
a specific set of days, but you know what I'm saying, like the
yeah.
distinction between being sad versus
Yeah. So if you look at the DSM's criteria, which is the Diagnostic Statistical Manual, kind of like, what we've used, right? It's 2 weeks. It says 2 weeks of pervasive sadness almost all day, every day. That doesn't mean 24 hours, but most of the day. Most of the day, all day, every day for 2 weeks with other symptoms like can't sleep or too much sleep, can't eat or eating too much, maybe some weight loss or weight gain, can't, thoughts of suicide or suicidal ideation or hopelessness, helplessness, guilt, aches, pains, with all of those symptoms and the 2 weeks, that's when the DSM suggests that you should seek treatment or help.
How can families and friends support people who are going through mental health concerns, like whether it's anxiety or
Mhm.
depression?
I would say the number one thing that I've learned is empathy. If we can't empathize, our family members won't talk to us about it. Because usually what they'll think is, I'm going to tell somebody my most personal, embarrassing, you know, like I go back to children because I always think about kids and like you were talking about teens, right? Teens already look, or children look at their parents, and their parents are doing everything better than them by a thousandfold. These parents are smart and capable and have a job and pay the mortgage and they're on time and they're disciplined and they're motivated. And kids already feel like, I can never do it as good as them. I can never be as good as them. They already don't feel very capable. Then parents are always giving them advice. You're doing this wrong. You do this. You should do this. You should do this. Again, their self esteem is going lower and lower. So for them to then open up, whether it be teenagers, and remember, when you're depressed or anxious, you're not always acting your age.
Yeah.
You can be a 35-year-old woman who should be capable, but if the part of you that feels depressed and anxious is like that 5-year-old inside of you, you're not going to feel very good or comfortable telling people. You're going to feel scared and embarrassed and ashamed. So I always tell people, if you really want to support your family members, ask them what they're feeling, and when they tell you, don't give them any advice. Instead, think about the time you felt that. There is no emotion that they're experiencing that you have not experienced
Um,
across the board. So if they're sad, you've been sad. If they're lonely, you've been lonely. If they're angry, you've been angry. So you keep it short and you say something like, oh, I get it. You're frustrated. I remember I did this. I was so frustrated too. And then you keep it short because obviously you don't want to make it about you. And then you say, tell me more. The number one thing, I believe you. Tell me more. And then as they open up and they start sharing a little bit more about it, they might eventually ask, what do I do? And then you, again, don't take the bait, right? I tell parents all the time, do you want your children's self-esteem to grow? Because if you do, stop giving them advice and let them figure out their how to get it better. And then say, you're smart. What do you think you can do? And then they will start giving you there'll be real communication. And for people who have experienced real compassion and real empathy and real active listening, I think the chances of those people actually getting better or getting help or feeling understood just goes through the roof. It's such an amazing thing to have empathy for people.
What are your thoughts on the impact of social media on mental well-being, anxiety, and depression? I think it's a lot.
I
I,
agree with you
I
so
want
much.
everybody to hear it from a psychologist.
So let's talk about, there's this thing right now, it's called rotting in bed. And it's something that teenagers are experiencing.
What is that?
So the idea is that a lot of young girls
Uh-huh.
they wake up in the morning and they're kind of paralyzed. They're unable to get out of bed. And it's really prevalent right now. And the reason is because let's look at the neurotransmitter dopamine. And dopamine is all about focus and motivation. So dopamine is such a great, neurochemical. It gives us motivation, it gives us focus, and we're getting so much dopamine from social media right now. We are getting hits and
The
hits and hits and
constant
hits.
scrolling. Mhm.
Yes, the constant scrolling. Now, dopamine is fantastic if you've earned it. If you have done something hard and you get a rush of dopamine, it's amazing. That's why cold plunges are a big thing right now, because you put yourself in a really, really hard position. You freeze your butt off. You're so uncomfortable. And what happens after it? Rush of dopamine. You earned that dopamine. Working out for an hour, you
You aren't
earned that
doing it.
dopamine, right? But now what's happening is, without earning dopamine, we are getting so many hits of dopamine really, really quickly, to the point where our system is going to kind of crash and burn. And so these young girls, they're scrolling until 2, 3, 4 in the morning. And we're thinking, oh, the girls are depressed and they're anxious because of social media, because they're comparing themselves. They don't feel good enough. Yes, that's definitely one explanation. But here's the neuroscience behind it. They have zero dopamine when they wake up in the morning. Their system has crashed. So they're not motivated. They have nothing left inside them for them to even get out of bed.
This is true
So
for adults too, right?
definitely with adults. We're seeing it a lot more with teenagers, just because, adults have a prefrontal cortex that's fully developed. So they at some point say, I gotta go to work in the morning, I need to go to bed.
Yeah.
But teenagers have all the emotions, and none of that prefrontal cortex isn't fully developed till 25 for women, 26 for men. So they're more likely to have come these risky behaviors where they'll stay up till 3, 4 in the morning. I've done it. My daughter does it.
Yeah, yeah.
But right? So we do it. What we don't realize is, why do we have brain fog in the morning? Why do we feel depleted? Why do we feel so tired? Why do we feel so unmotivated? And it's literally because we're lacking so much dopamine in the morning. So the first thing I would say is, we definitely, social media, we need to phone fast for so many reasons. When I ask children,
Yeah.
what's the number one problem with them? They say, my parents are always on their phone. So you ask couples, what's the problem? What is my argument with my husband? I start talking to him, the screen comes up. And it's like, wow, so what's happening there? Oxytocin. Oxytocin is that bonding hormone, right? We get it when we are in love. We get it when we touch, when we hug, when we speak. We don't get oxytocin when we text people. We get oxytocin when we hear someone's voice. We can get a flood of oxytocin when we're FaceTiming, or right now, the way we are Zooming.
Right.
This is oxytocin because we're connecting and we're feeling and we're understanding each other. It doesn't happen over text. But when a screen gets in front of your partner, your oxytocin levels go down. So children are not experiencing oxytocin, parents are not experiencing it, partners are not experiencing it, all because of the screens. And going back to dopamine, it's not just your phone, it is any screen, whether it's your computer screen or your TV screen. If you want to have more dopamine, which is motivation and focus, watch a podcast. Because when you start a podcast, you're not going to get a rush of dopamine. It's not amazing the first 1 second. It takes
Right.
time for that podcast, maybe 10, 20 minutes into it. You're like, oh, this is interesting. Read a book. It takes a while for dopamine to hit when you're reading a book.
That
But
is
it's
real.
that's real. But these short bursts of dopamine that we do when we scroll, it's like you get the hit, the hit, the hit. It's like eating sugar. You get the spike, you feel great, then you crash and burn. And then it's depleted out of your system.
And then is it true? I was listening to another podcast on dopamine, and they were explaining that I can scroll for 5 minutes today to get a certain dopamine hit. Tomorrow it has to be 8 minutes. After that, it has to be 10 minutes. So it gradually I have to do more of
You're
scrolling,
at,
whatever
yeah,
other artificial means that I'm, trying to achieve dopamine. Is that theory?
absolutely true.
Can you
Because
explain
you
that a little bit?
Sure, it's addiction. Just like addiction, you build a tolerance. So now your brain has to work even harder, because the minute you get that level, now at that level, you don't get, just like with people that have struggled with addiction, they'll drink 2 beers and they'll get a buzz. But the next time when they drink the 2 beers, they've leveled off. And now your brain just needs more to get intoxicated.
The same thing is happening with kids too.
It
Is
is.
like constant Instagram, social media
Yes.
exposure.
Right. And remember, dopamine is the hormone or the neurochemical of more. Dopamine is motivation. What that means is, the more you scroll, the more you are motivated to scroll.
Yeah.
Serotonin is the hormone or the neurotransmitter of of happiness, of enough, of contentment, of I'm good. But dopamine is more, 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 more. That's why it's so addictive because it keeps motivating us. That's why we get a hit of dopamine and we're like, oh, I achieved this goal. Well, the minute you get dopamine, dopamine doesn't say now rest. Dopamine says, what's the next goal? What's the next goal? And I understand why we have it. Like, let's go back to hunter-gatherer days,
Yeah.
right? We needed dopamine for someone to go out and hunt for 4 hours. They
Right.
needed focus to hunt for that deer. They needed the motivation to go out to do it. But now we're not hunting for our food. We have everything accessible. Now the dopamine we're getting is from social media instead of working hard, instead of exercising, instead of doing something that we don't want to do. But here's a hack that I love that I've been using with my clients. If you want real dopamine, first thing when you wake up, get rid of your phone. Do not have your phone in your room. Get an old-fashioned alarm clock. I got the Hatch, right? It wakes you up with sounds and music and sunlight.
I got
Get
one too. Yeah.
Yeah, isn't that great? So do not see your phone. And I'm not going to even say an hour. I use it, I don't see my phone for an hour. I'll say 15 minutes. The best forms of dopamine in the morning, get up and brush your teeth. After you brush your teeth, make your bed. You'll get a surge of dopamine for making your bed because it's a little bit of an effort that nobody wants to do in the morning, right? You have a million other things to do. Most people get up and start looking at their phone. Once you see the phone and the dopamine comes in through that artificial way, you've already set yourself up for failure.
Have the need. Yeah.
So brush your teeth, make your bed, you get some dopamine. That's going to motivate you to do the next thing, which is do not see a screen until you've gotten some natural sunlight. Go outside, open the door, get to a window, get some natural sunlight in. That sunlight is going to give you, melatonin, which is going to help you sleep at night. So you're not scrolling till 3 in the morning. The whole system is set up. After that, I've been doing this. And the interesting thing is when you make your bed, when you get the sunlight, when you are then motivated, then you can kind of maybe go for a walk or work out or do those hard things that you don't want to do. You can do the first meeting that you don't want to do. You're more motivated to do it. So dopamine and then you can check your phone. That's fine. And then at nighttime too, don't scroll on your phone an hour before bed and instead read a book or listen to a podcast. Again, long form videos don't give you that kind of dopamine. So it's just the scrolling. That's terrible.
I'm just asking for me. Can you explain? I was reading an article. They were talking about dopamine peak and base and how we all have like a baseline dopamine, but the baseline would drop if you continue accessing and look for artificial like ways to get dopamine. How does the base and the peak work?
So the base of dopamine basically just means like, let's
We
say
all
that
have a certain level, right? Baseline.
yes, we
Okay.
all have a baseline for dopamine. And let's go to something like fasting, for example,
Okay.
right? So the reason that if somebody does fasting for, it's like 24 to 36 hours, people that are big fasters, what they'll realize is 3 days into fasting, they are going to have a lot of clarity. They're going to have like I've done that before. Your eyes get better, your ears get better, you hear
Really?
better. Yeah.
Like
You
just 3 days of like fast. When you say fasting, what do you eat? Or you don't
So,
really?
so this is not eating. This is like I did like a 10-day fast, like a water fast, where you're just having water and then you put lemon and you put cayenne, you put maple syrup in it to give you some energy so you don't pass out. But it's like a 10-day fast. And I think the third or fourth day, the digestive system kind of shuts down. Your stomach's not grumbling anymore. And you get huge peaks of dopamine. You get a lot of clarity. I remember my eyes got better, my ears got better. So let's go
Oh,
back to hunter-gatherer. If they are hungry, the body says, oh my God, this person is starving. They're going to die. Let's give them lots of dopamine. Why? Focus, motivation. This will motivate them to get out of bed, go out there and hunt and find food, not just for themselves, but for their family, for the community. It's going to keep the species alive. Your body, you don't need artificial dopamine. Your body has such an incredible amount of dopamine and serotonin and oxytocin. It's all inside of us. But we have to put our body in a state where the oxytocin or the dopamine is released. So let's say you're hungry, you're fasting. Your body is going to become ultra your brain gets ultra focused. You get very motivated to search for food or find food. And that's when that dopamine surges. Once you get the dopamine, once you've eaten and you're satiated, then it kind of comes down and you're feeling good again. And then next time, but you have to put your body into some sort of state for your body to produce that dopamine for you to be focused. Now, if we keep putting artificial dopamine into our system, the brain is always coming back to homeostasis. It's saying, this is too pleasurable. This is too much, like, especially with artificial dopamine, this is too pleasurable. Let's bring you back to homeostasis. And it'll actually start giving you, like, for example, let's say you eat a lot of sugar. You're eating all these amazing desserts and it feels really yummy. And you're like, dopamine, dopamine, dopamine,
That's
right?
dopamine too, yeah.
But what'll happen is it'll start creating like stomach ache. You'll feel brain fog. You'll start feeling, because your body is saying too much dopamine, it'll start kind of like making that whole effect more negative to bring you back into homeostasis. So when you do pleasurable things, it'll bring you down. It'll actually hurt you. Same thing with alcohol. Let's say you drink and drink and drink, have a great night of drinking. Next day, you feel like crap. Why? Because it's your body's way of bringing you back to homeostasis. Same thing if you do something that's not good for you, not good for you, not pleasurable. When you exercise, when you do the cold plunge, when you do like a long hike, when you do really hard, excessive work, you're working so hard. Now, that's not pleasurable. But what the brain says is, this person is working so hard. Let's give them a surge of dopamine in order at
That
the
is not going
end.
to drop your baseline.
No, that doesn't drop below your baseline. But when you're doing a lot of artificial dopamine and you're doing too much dopamine, it will it'll bring your dopamine, your brain will bring your dopamine down, but not to your baseline. It'll bring it below your baseline. It'll bring it below your baseline, kind of to, in some ways, it feels a little bit like a punishment not to keep repeating that behavior, if that makes sense.
Interesting. Yeah, 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 yeah. I love it. Let's talk about another of my favorite topics, love versus attachment.
Yes.
And we can get into attachment styles.
Yeah. So, I love this topic as well. And I think,
Yes, there's so much I want to ask you. But yeah,
yeah, I think, that idea of attachment, it comes from me, it feels very much like that insecure attachment. And we can talk about different attachment styles, but basically, I think just the gist of it could be that love is always safe and secure. Love always feels like there's safety there. And by safety, I mean like somebody in your life is reliable and dependable. They say what they do what they say. And somebody that is not safe. So here's an example. Here's attachment. I asked a client this, and I had a therapist ask me this. I said, what does it feel like if your relationship is like this? Opposed to, what does it feel like if your relationship is like this? So I asked, a client, what does it feel like if your relationship is like this? And I want you to guess what they would say. Your relationship is like this.
they don't
Just
like it.
no, they say it's boring.
It's boring, yeah. Versus roller
Boring
coaster, yeah.
versus the roller coaster. So a lot of times that attachment to me, it feels very much like addiction. It is the highest highs and the lowest lows, just like an addiction is. You are so, so, so high, then you crash, and then there's withdrawals, and you go back to the high, you go back. This is a secure attachment. It's safe, it's secure, it feels steady, it feels reliable. You're open, you have space, you're able to be honest, you are heard. And we have confused that with boring. Why? Because addicts don't like this. They crave the highs and the lows. So love addiction to me feels very much like that kind of that fake attachment opposed to that real love.
Real love, yeah. And
Yeah.
what are the three attachment styles? I think what I know is the anxious,
Hmm.
secure,
Hmm.
the avoidant.
Yes. Yes.
And I have also read that the best pair is when avoidant pairs with anxious.
Oh yeah. Oh my goodness. That was
Do
me for
you
a long
do
time.
you see? Oh, really?
Yeah.
Can you explain that?
Sure. So, I had a real opportunity when I was working, or actually, yeah, I was working at a clinic where we did a lot of attachment style type stuff with moms and kids.
Mhm.
And my supervisor, she was incredible at emotional regulation and attachment theory. So just
And
to
it
go
goes
back,
down to childhood, right?
yeah, and so just the history of it really quick. But attachment theory, who it started with Bowlesby, thank you, Bowlesby. Bowlesby started attachment theory. It was just like an idea the psychologist had, and then he had a dissertation. He had a student doing her dissertation on attachment theory, and her name was Mary Ainsworth, and she created this thing called the strange situation. And it was basically this idea that we're going to bring in a 1 year old with their mother, could be mother or father. This was developed back, I think, honestly, in the 50s or before then. So it was
Okay.
clearly more the mother because mothers were more of the primary caregiver. But the idea was we bring a mother and a child into the room and we do this whole experiment. And that's what was really attachment theory. And the idea that Bowlby said was if we can predict what this child at the age of 1, how they reunify or reconnect with the mother, that will determine how they will connect with their partners when they are older and in
Really?
adult relationships. Yeah. So this was a very long study, replicated again and again and again. So fast forward, I'm in this clinic now working with Dr. Newton, and this is what we would do. We would just replicate the same experiment. We'd have like one room we were in, another neutral room. This was always how it was done. It's a very simple experiment. You bring a mom in with their 1 year old child. Why one? Because younger than one, and we really can't get much information. They're just so young. Anything older than one, they kind of start manipulating things. So we want like this specimen where we can
Okay.
really,
Yeah.
right, figure out what their signs are, what the patterns are. So a 1 year old mom comes in, we're in another room with like a mirror where they can't see us, we can see them. And then we tell the mom it's a empty room, completely neutral. The child's never been there. There's a bunch of toys on the floor. And we ask the mom to sit in the chair. She sits in the chair and we start watching. And what we'll notice mostly is a secure child will get out of the mom's lap and start playing with the toys. And already what we're seeing is when my mom is in the room, I feel safe and I can go explore my environment.
Right.
That's basically it. I've worked with a lot in this scenario because this was also, did the same work at a homeless shelter, had a lot of moms that did not have secure children. So what I would do is, when I was doing any kind of testing with the children, developmental testing, they wouldn't leave the mom's lap. Those are insecure children. They won't even leave to go play. And we'll talk about why. But anyways, secure child gets off the mom's lap, plays with the toys. New toys, child's interested. We cue the mom, leave the room. Mom gets up, she leaves the room. I don't care how amazing the toys are. Every single child should cry. A
Right.
secure child should cry. So the secure children would look around, see mom is left, get distraught, crawl, walk, whatever, get to the door and cry and cry and cry. Now, we let the children cry for about a minute. Then we would send a stranger into the room. That's why this experiment is called a strange situation. The stranger comes in the room, tries to comfort the child. We really want the child not to be comforted. We don't want strangers comforting children. That's not secure attachment. Stranger leaves, then we send mom in. Now, the entire experiment is based on how the child responds to the mom's return. So this is what we noticed. Secure children, when the mom comes back, she puts her arms out. Secure children will pretty quickly go to mom. She'll hold them and she'll be able to comfort them. Pretty soon we'll hear something like this. After the child
Yeah.
cries, that
Yeah.
that kind of coming back, they're able to say, okay, you were here, I was happy, you left, I became distraught, you came back, and I was hurt, but you comforted me. And the last step of a secure child was when the mom comforted the child and sat down, the child got off her lap and started playing again.
Playing again. Yeah.
So that's a secure
Yeah.
child. So
Yeah.
here's an insecure child. We have two insecures, right? Like you said, anxious and avoidant. The avoidant child, mom would come back. The avoidant child wouldn't look at mom, would turn its back towards mom, wouldn't go to mom, sometimes would cry, sometimes would not cry. Basically, an avoidant child is telling us, regardless of what the mom tells us, avoidant child is telling us, mom's not around. She's not available. She's consistently not here for me, emotionally neglecting me. And so I'm not going to really cry when she leaves. Some did, but I'm not going to go back to her when she comes. I'm not going to let her comfort me because it's not consistent and I don't trust her and I cannot predict when she's going to be around. So there's no connection, there's no attachment there.
So this is avoidant.
This is the avoidant. Now, the anxious looks secure when the mom comes back. The anxious goes to mom, doesn't avoid. Mom holds the baby, comforts the baby, and we give it a minute, 2 minutes, 3 minutes. The anxious baby doesn't stop crying. The anxious baby throws its head back. The anxious baby kicks its legs. The anxious baby is very dysregulated. So we'll cue the mom. Give the baby a pacifier, throws it. Give the baby a bottle, throws it. Give the baby a toy, throws it. The anxious baby is basically telling us, sometimes you're around, sometimes you're not. Sometimes you're secure, sometimes you love me, sometimes you neglect me, sometimes you love me, sometimes you abuse me, sometimes you love me, sometimes you're available, sometimes you're not available. And that is a very, very distressing thing for a child when they cannot trust their caregiver because there's so much confusion going on. So that's your anxious baby. Then there's a fourth one, which we call disorganized. And the disorganized is a combination of anxious and avoidant. When we see this in adult relationships, a lot of people have, not a lot, I would say, I think the numbers, I'm not exactly sure, they continue to change, but I would say 30 to 40% of people are securely attached in this country. And the other 30 are probably anxious and avoidant, or maybe a little bit less because there's a percentage in there that is the disorganized amount. What we noticed is the disorganized children usually have more chronic stress, chronic trauma, very early on trauma, and the avoidance. So why does this show up later on in life? Because
a long time, 1 year
it's
old. And then when you start forming relationships,
but the blueprint is there.
Blueprint is there. Yeah.
And the brain has learned what is safe, what is not safe.
So
So remember, a lot of this
remembers that for that many years.
The body remembers and the brain remembers because it's not a one-time thing. This is going to repeat itself again and again and again. So let's take that avoidant baby and let's put that avoidant baby in school. And he's 5 now. And you're going to see the same type of behavior. There's going to be a 5-year-old who has a fight with another child, and an anxious baby will want to please and want to get that child who fought with him to be his friend again. Why won't he be my friend? Why won't he play with me? Why? But why? That's your anxious child. The avoidant child is like, that's it. He doesn't want to play with me. I'm never going to play with him again.
Does anxious personality or attachment style, are they people pleasers?
Definitely.
They are. Okay.
They're terrified of abandonment. So the number one thing we see with anxious attachment style is they're terrified of abandonment. Now, if you're terrified of abandonment, you're going to do everything to keep your partner. You're going to text them 50 times. You're going to call them 100 times. You're going to people please. You're going to try. But here's the opposite side of it. You're going to be emotionally volatile. You're going to be angry. You're going to be, sometimes very unstable. You're going to be threatening and manipulative and crying. And remember, it's ambivalence, right? There's not emotional regulation. There's a lot of I love you. So here's a book title written about the anxious attachment style. I love you, don't leave me. That's a book title. And that summarizes it. I love you. I know. I hate you, don't leave me. So I hate you, but you can't leave me. So they are so ambivalent. They're afraid of love, but they want love, and it comes and they push it away and they don't know how to deal with it because of all that inconsistent kind of parenting that happened so young that they don't know exactly how to deal with it. And now the avoidant, so I'll give you an example again. So my son, when I was, in my marriage, my first marriage, it was in a very abusive marriage, and I was very, very depressed and anxious and not at all. Remember, I was there, but I was not there, not the way a child needs. And what children need to be secure is attunement. They need mirroring. They need modeling of appropriate behavior. And if they have a depressed mother who is completely gone, terrifying for a child. And so a child might look at the mom like that and be like, She's not around. She's here physically, but she's not around. And my son, very avoidant. Even now in his relationships, very avoidant, even though he knows these things. We've talked about it. And now the whole cycle continues because they then, that blueprint. Now, I'm not saying that they're going to be like that their whole lives. What if they realize that they're doing that and they get help and they get someone to show them those patterns and they start working on it? And I would say to an anxious attachment style person, okay, put the phone down. If you have a tendency to call someone 50 times and text message because you're terrified, put the phone down and walk away and cope and breathe and regulate yourself. They might get better. And an avoidant, I would say, every time there's an argument, you leave, right? You get in the car and you drive away. Don't drive away. Stay. Deal with that conflict. Talk to the person. Tell them how you're feeling. Put that shell, that mask, whatever you have on, bring it down and talk about it. So if we do the opposite of whatever the tendency is to do, we can change our attachment style because we're all hardwired for secure attachment. Every one of us, it's in our DNA to be securely attached. It's just a very early onset of like how our brains were wired. And if we continue doing that same behavior, it just keeps getting reinforced. Like avoidant people will say, nobody's interested in me. Nobody likes me. People really don't want to be my friend. And they believe it. And anxious people say, they're very preoccupied. They're going to say, I love this person so much, but they're just not, they're not always there for me. I'm not sure if they love me. Do they love me? Do they not love me? They're preoccupied. So it reinforces the behavior. Those thoughts reinforce the behavior. It's not just what happened, it's the million reinforcements along their life.
This can be, like you said, changed by therapy. Of course,
Yeah.
first.
Yeah, it can be recognized, it can be changed by therapy, it can be changed by, again, I've had clients read books. There's this great book by Pia Mellody called Facing Love Addiction, and it talks about what you said earlier, the anxious and the avoidant. It is a match made in heaven, right? Well, actually, it's a match made in hell because it's the most terrible
Yeah.
relationship. But that book, when I read it, I thought, oh my God, this is me. This is what I've been doing for like 7 years. I've playing this game with, I was the anxious and he was the avoidant, and we kept going back and forth. And there's a whole reason for it. And when, next time we talk about it, we can do the whole, because I would do the anxious avoidant on a board in a group, and people would say to me, that's my relationship. How did you know? I'm like, it's not yours.
I actually want to do that. Yeah, it's take
Mhm.
attachment theories and then we can actually talk about it, how it looks in a relationship. And if you have like a chart, I think that would help a lot.
Yeah, it's really eye-opening because you see it and you're like, oh my God, these are my behaviors and these are his behaviors, or vice versa. And then we can change attachment styles. We can go from very anxious in one relationship to a very avoidant in another relationship because we're like, I've been hurt. I will never do this again. Now I'm going to put on that armor and I'm not going to open up.
I was
So,
going to ask you that does your past unhealthy relationship affect your future? I'm sure it does because you
yeah.
get used to, yeah.
And you create a schema in your mind.
Yes.
If you've had one or two experiences, then it's very natural for us to think all people are like this, or this is how I am. We identify with these things because it's a visceral experience. There's a lot of pain and emotion involved. So those schemas then create, and better than anybody, what we think, it shows up.
So a secure attachment style, like a secure attachment person going through unhealthy relationship can become anxious or can
Um,
develop an anxious attachment style, or it's not possible.
No, I don't think so. A secure partner, a secure person thinks like this. I want to be in a relationship. I love people and intimacy, and I can talk about my feelings. I don't have to be in a relationship. I don't need it. I want it. I can also be independent. I can also be autonomous. If I'm not treated well, I don't stick around too long. I talk about it, I confront it. I don't play games, I don't manipulate, I don't hide, I don't blame. I have open conversations. But if somebody isn't giving me really what I need, I, in a loving, respectful way, say, this isn't actually working for me. That's a secure partner. They have no problem meeting their partner's needs. They're able to listen. They don't get defensive. They don't blame. They also have no problem expressing their needs. They're like, hey, I understand that this is something that you're doing, but this is what I need. And especially as women, we tell men how we feel. We don't tell men what we need. And
Okay.
secure partners have no problem with that. They're like, I have no problem doing that for you. Hey, but here's what I need in a relationship. And they are secure enough to say, and if my needs aren't met, this might not be the right relationship for me. Very different than an anxious who will continue to stay in an unhealthy relationship for fear of abandonment. Very different from an avoidant who will prematurely leave a relationship instead of actually working it through. So what I would say is secure partners don't become anxious or avoidant, but anxious and avoidant people become more secure if they have a secure partner.
If they're in a stable relationship, yeah.
Yeah, if they can find a secure partner and they will do all of their whatever they do,
You
like,
have to work on it too, yeah, because it's actually
yeah.
a lot of work. If
So
you
the
have been, yeah.
the the work happens in relationship because anytime that I was alone, I thought, I'm good. Look at me. I'm doing great. And then put me in a relationship and I was a nutcase. So the way that I got more secure, you have to practice it in relationship because relationship puts a huge spotlight on all of your unhealed stuff. And we can talk about relationships. It's like I can talk about swimming and do PowerPoints on swimming and do a dissertation on swimming, but unless I get in the water, I don't know anything about swimming.
Right.
And same thing with relationships. I could talk about relationships, but the minute you put me in a relationship, I was completely dysfunctional. So how do you get secure? You get into a relationship. And anxious people don't want to because anxious people say, oh, I want to be independent. Oh, I don't need a relationship. But what they're actually doing is they're not working on what it means to be vulnerable, to be honest, to be real, to deal with these uncomfortable feelings. And anxious people can't let go of the relationship long enough for them to work on themselves. But relationships, being in a healthy relationship with a secure partner is, I think, ultimately the way to get there. So therapy is good. Reading is good. YouTube videos are great. But your therapist is going to be with you for an hour a week. That partner is going to be with you 24/7, and it's going to actually be the thing that helps you to become more secure.
Where does codependency fall into all this?
So the codependency has usually three things I've seen with people who have codependency. They've either seen some form of abuse in their childhood or growing up, whether it be witnessing abuse or going through abuse themselves. It could be physical, emotional, sexual, mental. They've usually seen some form of addiction in the family. Somebody's kind of has some addiction issues, or they've seen some sort of health issues. Somebody has a health issue in the family. Somebody is either physically or even mentally has mental health or physical health issues. And the reason these three things show up is because the trademark of codependency is the person that's codependent will always put their needs last. So it makes sense if somebody's abusive in the family. Let's say dad is abusive, and it doesn't even have to be extreme. It could be dad drinks and gets angry and gets mad. So mom says, shh, don't get him mad. Don't speak too loud. Don't come home late. Don't turn on the light. Right? So that is like tiptoe around the abusive person. Then the alcoholic, same thing. Someone with addiction, tiptoe around. Like, let's say there's a family member that has an addiction. Everybody caters to him and does everything. Don't make him mad. Don't do this. The third thing is illness. Your mom is depressed. What is wrong with you? So this is what I've heard from clients. A 5-year-old saying, my mom had severe depression. And when I said to her, can you make me a sandwich or can you button my shirt? My mom said, are you so selfish? Can't you see that I need to sleep? So this child starts putting his needs last. So tiptoeing around people. So codependency, this whole idea is everybody's needs are more important than mine. And so I'm going to go ahead and become completely codependent on fixing other people.
Things, yeah.
So that's really what codependency is. It's like fixing other people instead of setting boundaries and saying, like a secure person would, you know what, this doesn't work for me. I'm sorry, this is not helping me. Instead, it's saying, it's okay, self-sacrifice. Like, I will fix this person. I will enable this person. I will do. And we see it a lot with addiction. because I see it in my family with like I had a cousin that struggled with addiction, would be drinking, coming home late, and I remember the mom at 2 a.m. she would quietly wake up the sister and she would say, go make roti for him before your dad hears, open the door, let him in so the dad doesn't get
Yeah.
mad. This is codependency. It's not letting him actually have consequences and fixing his behavior. It's enabling and enabling out of love and out of sacrifice. But what happens is the addict gets worse. The dad gets angrier, the sister becomes resentful, and the mom feels like nobody loves me and I sacrifice so much. But that's a whole cycle of codependency.
Wow. We all have seen these behaviors.
Right? I think we all have. Yeah.
There is a name for it now.
Yeah, there's a name for so much of this behavior, like enmeshment. I didn't know what enmeshment was. I just thought I didn't know what codependency was. I didn't know what boundaries were. I thought all of that was family. That was my family. So for me, it was normal. All of it was normal.
So, what clients do you see the most as a psychologist? Like, what aspect of psychological problems? Is it like anxiety, depression, attachment, like relationship problems, healthy, unhealthy? What is it that you work with more?
So I think most people show up with anxiety. And that's probably the number one thing that I see. Stress and anxiety, and they like to make it a little bit lighter. So they don't even call it anxiety; they'll call it stress. So whenever I've worked with any population, it starts with stress. We kind of go into, hey, why are you anxious? You go a little bit deeper, and a little bit deeper, and sometimes months later, I'll realize there's a lot of trauma underneath it. So the symptoms are anxiety, but what's going on underneath is usually
Oh,
trauma.
is something, wow.
Yeah. So it could be childhood trauma, it could be sexual trauma, it could be secrets, it could be shame, it could be hiding, it could be all these things that happened that they buried, and what showed up is anxiety. And because it became so unmanageable, they're here to treat the anxiety, but eventually we get to the root cause. And the way that I would work with people is I'll say, well, let's stop the bleeding first, right? Because if you're anxious, I'm not going to say, hey, let's figure out the root cause, what happened. We want to make sure that you're able to function and you don't lose your job, or that you're able to go to class, or you're able to cope with in your relationships. But once we get the anxiety under control, let's not just treat the symptoms, because they will come back unless we get to the root cause, which is then we go a little bit deeper and deeper. And there's almost always a root cause, conscious or unconscious. There's always a reason why. And a lot of it stems from some form of trauma. And trauma, again, doesn't have to be a big catastrophic thing. It
Yeah.
can just be a time in your life where you felt overwhelmed by emotion and you were alone.
What are some of the rewarding aspects of your work as a psychologist? What are some of the biggest challenges?
So I would say the biggest challenges are, well, let's start with the rewarding aspect. I think seeing myself in clients and clients seeing themselves in me. I think it is the most rewarding work because it's the most real work. It is the most authentic work.
It's real work, yeah.
Yeah. It just feels when I worked at a rehab, I would tell my clients, I would leave at 5 o'clock and I would feel sad leaving because it's an inpatient facility. They live there. I had to go home. And I would say, you guys are the bravest, most real people in my life. And I
Yeah.
feel more at home here with you than I do out in the world. Because if you've decided to go into a rehab for 30 days where you're going to talk about everything that ever happened to you and finally deal with it, I haven't done that. I can't do that. So how authentic and real and vulnerable and courageous are you? So I could see myself in their behaviors. I could see all the dysfunction that I've done, and I could see it in them. And there weren't words. Like I wouldn't tell them that, but it's like anyone that's ever sat across from me, I have been there. And I feel like that compassion for them and for myself, it just feels like I'm finally with people that I can relate with, and this is real. I don't have to pretend. It's not exhausting, it's exhilarating. That's how I would explain it.
That's awesome. And what are some of the challenges?
The challenges in the beginning.
Coming, constantly listening to people, does it take a toll on you sometimes?
Yeah, that was the biggest part in the beginning was shutting it off and feeling their pain and feeling very anxious. I mean, I still would get anxious. I would sit in a trauma group, leading the group, and I would be doing this, which I guess was self-soothing. I still do it. It's like my way of comforting myself when somebody's talking about something really traumatic because you feel it in your body. And what it did for me was it made me realize how much work I had to do on myself because I couldn't fix them. I couldn't enable them. I I couldn't run. So I had to work on myself. So I had to do my own work because they literally will trigger everything unhealed inside of me.
Yeah. Yes.
So then that sent me on a path of emotional regulation and mindfulness and meditation and working through my own anger. So they saved me, right? They allowed me to do all the work I didn't want to do.
It's hard. Even
Yeah.
talking to friends about it brings so many, like you said, of your hidden things that we haven't worked on. It comes out
Yeah.
listening to other people. So, as a profession, when that's all you're doing, it can be easy.
It's not easy, but again, here's some of my things I didn't know how to do. I didn't know how to set boundaries. I didn't know how to not fix people. I didn't know how to get overly involved, and this work forced me to set boundaries because I can't take a call at 11 o'clock at night, right? Unless obviously it's an emergency. I have to trust that I've done the best, and this client needs to self-soothe. They need to emotionally regulate because if I rescue them every time, I'm not teaching them anything. I'm not actually helping them. I can't continue to enable them. So it taught me a lot about boundaries. It taught me a lot about my own self-care, my own meditation. My mom would say to me, I'd get angry with her and she'd be like, it sounds like your meditation's not working. And I get more angry. And I'd be like, Mom, if I was a centered, calm person, if I was just so emotionally regulated, I wouldn't need meditation. I need it more than anybody. And so literally this work forced me to have my own practice and so it is hard, but at the same time it gets like when I was teaching, I taught for about 10 years and I was very anxious teaching. And again, the students taught me how to regulate my emotions and deal with my anxiety and face instead of avoiding it, face it day in, day out. I'd get anxious with clients, but the more you do it and the more you sit with it, the better you get. So I feel more free today because they gave me the practice of sitting with these difficult emotions day in, day out.
Yeah, that's amazing. This was really good.
Thank
We
you.
touched upon
It was great. It's
all
always great
stuff,
talking to you.
anxiety, depression, attachment styles, dopamine. We had not even planned, but that was
Yeah.
conversation. I do want to, next time in part two, I do want to talk about neuroplasticity.
Yeah, it's
And
a great topic.
we can talk about mindfulness too. You have specialized in that, right? The
Yeah.
neuroscience.
Mhm.
Yeah. So we can talk
Mhm.
about that. And we can go in depth detail about the different attachment theories.
Yeah, I would love to do that. I'd love to go into each one of them and then create that, like we were talking about, like what is that dance between the anxious and the avoidant, and
Yes.
really describe it, talk about why it happens, what
Yes.
are the functions of it, why do people get into these relationships, and then how they can get out of it. Like there's a real, like kind of like for me, it was a little bit eye-opening to see why we get into it, kind of the unconscious processes behind it, and how we can get out.
One thing I do want to ask, what is the psychology behind partners not wanting to leave an unhealthy relationship?
Well, I don't know if you've ever heard of learned helplessness, but the idea is that if you have a very small baby elephant, elephants are big, but when they're babies, they're not as big as a 2 or 3 ton, adult elephant. But if you take a small baby elephant, and people in the circus do this all the time, they'll take a small chain, they'll tie the chain to the baby elephant's foot, and they'll tie it to a wooden stake and they'll put it in the ground. And the baby elephant will try a few times to escape. And it tries and it tries and it tries and it realizes it just can't escape. It's just not strong enough. Now, that same elephant, the chain gets a little bit bigger. Same stake in the ground, the adult elephant. They have the same chain, bigger, in the same stake. If that elephant wanted, forget the stake. It could rip the whole tree out of the ground. But because that baby elephant learned not to leave, the same baby grows into an adult and still, even when it's 3 tons, it doesn't leave. And the whole idea is, again, it's that blueprint. It's the body remembers, the brain remembers. Remember, about 95 to 97% of our behavior, our patterns, they come from the unconscious mind, from the unconscious and subconscious mind. So what are we dealing with? 3%, 5% of the conscious mind? So if habits and patterns come from the subconscious mind, and the subconscious mind is wide open when you're a child, when you're a baby, and everything is being put in there, that's your blueprint. And you're now an adult and you're dealing with this very small percentage, you're not going to be able to change a behavior or a habit until you go into the subconscious mind, look at your beliefs, your core beliefs about the world, about you, about relationships. And if you don't change it there, then the behavior doesn't change. It's formed in that blueprint. So learned helplessness is one of them. I've worked with people that have actually been in abusive relationships. I worked with this one woman who said, I know he's going to hit me. I know the abuse is coming. So what do I do when he comes home from work? I have so much anxiety waiting for him to hit me that I'll do something on purpose that I know will bother him. Like I'll make a noise or I'll drop something. I'll get the abuse out of the way so that the rest of the evening I can relax. I mean, these are not healthy thoughts. But people that are in abusive relationships, they feel stuck. They feel dependent. They feel loyalty. They feel guilt. They feel shame about leaving their partners. And it's a very pervasive core belief that needs to change for the behavior to change. And that's just in a nutshell, but we can go into it deeper.
Thank you so much, Ayesha, for coming.
Yeah,
And I look forward to our part 2.
I do as well.